wonderful electronic invention I want you to see. It looks something like this.
The Veracity Podcast.
Discovery Sessions.
Welcome to this episode of Vancouver Island's very own The Veracity Podcast. This episode in particular explores artist and psychiatrist Brad Necyk's journey as a mental health researcher who had a diagnosis of severe bipolar disorder in his early 20s. Brad's unique perspective to mental illness and altered states of consciousness is truly fascinating. We talked about a variety of topics such as bipolar disorder, art as a form of therapy and expression, utilizing a mental illness, mindfulness and meditation, virtual reality, and finally the utility of psychedelics as medicine in the modern world. All right, enjoy the show. All right, so Brad, first and foremost, thanks for stepping on.
Yeah.
And I guess we have to give a shout out to Donnie and Barclay.
Yes.
Because they were the
Ooh
ones,
Gallery.
Yeah, from the Ooh Gallery, who sort of arranged this and stated that we need to get together and have a conversation.
For sure.
So here we are.
Yeah.
And I guess right out of the gate, you have a really interesting backstory.
Well, it depends on which backstory you're talking about.
The backstory in particular would be initially when you got diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
Yeah, for sure. So the lengthier but still shorter story is I was a sick kid. I had part of my large intestine wasn't working properly, and I had to go through lots of surgeries and tests and more surgeries and more tests and stuff like that. And so when I was maybe 3, I had a pretty significant surgery that I still remember, and a lengthy recovery. But then, I got better and lived a normal childhood. But when I was in university, I was doing an economics degree and started becoming a little bit more unusual. I was pretty sociable before, starting to become more eccentric, started really getting into music, finding ways to express myself. And I didn't know at the time, but I was diagnosed with anxiety and then depression and starting on different medications, and finished my degree, just barely got through my economics degree, and actually worked at a bank for a couple years and really did not jive well with that. And then my wife finished pharmacy school, and she got her license on July 1st. Maybe 2006 or 7. 2008. And that day I went back to art school. I was like, I don't want to do this whole business side of things. And went to art school, and once again, found that expressing myself was great, but was still definitely struggling. And after that year of school, with a fair amount of struggles, was finally got into the mental health system, and started seeing a psychologist. Finally got a psychiatrist that gave me a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and started treatment for that. And it changed my life.
How did the diagnosis change your life, though?
Yeah, well, for me, what it did is it gave me a moment to pause and re-narrate a lot of the things that were going on. There was a lot of frustration and I wouldn't go as far as to say anger, but agitation about a lot of things, and then being able to have a diagnosis and start learning about it and seeing kind of the pattern of how my life was fitting into that kind of helped me re-narrate a lot of my early 20s, because I was about 25 when I was diagnosed. And so it helped me see a bit more clearly some of the patterns, and then they started me on medications, and the medications started to really help. So for me, with my bipolar disorder, it was much more of a rapid cycling one. So oftentimes people with bipolar disorder might have 1 or 2 episodes in their entire life, and I was having episodes constantly moving between mania, which is a very fast, energetic, loss of inhibition kind of mode, and can be really destructive, because people often will spend tons of money or break up relationships or do something very, very extreme in their lives that they wouldn't normally do. And then depression obviously is, much more introspective, much more negative self-reflection going on. And I would sort of hover between those and fluctuate between those, but also get these weird mixed states where they would both kind of be present. So I wouldn't be sleeping I'd only be sleeping a couple hours a night, but then I was really, really not doing well and just kind of self-destructive. So the medications really quickly started to balance some of that out, getting some insights from my psychologist and my psychiatrist on how to live with something like this was really, really enlightening. But the thing is it's not like a quick it's not a quick answer and solution. It still took till this day. I'm still healing and recovering and learning and growing. So it's very much a journey you enter onto for the rest of your life and try to figure things out.
Of course. Was there some sort of catalyst, or did it just sort of arise? Like, was it based off of a certain amount of stress at school, or perhaps some sort of event? Or it really kicked in. My grandmother, who I was very, very close to, was dying at that time, and she died in November when I was 20, so partway into the school year. And then that was the first time I started not doing well on tests, just because I was very distracted, and I stopped going to school and I missed assignments and got through that term and still did relatively well. But then the next term, I started having panic attacks, and from scenarios like getting on a bus. Like, I'm not terribly claustrophobic, but I don't enjoy being in confined spaces. But bus rides became difficult, and that was my only way to go to school. So I try to get there, and I get partway there, and then get off the bus and go hang out at a coffee shop and miss most of the day of school, and then usually try to get back somehow when I was feeling a little bit better. So definitely my grandmother's death was a major catalyst, and it was the first death in my life. Like, I was fortunate enough, I never really had anybody close to me die or get significantly ill, and we were very close, and so it was a profound experience. Yeah. What factors really helped your journey? Like, once the diagnosis took place?
A lot of people living with mental health problems would understand this, that taking the medications suck for the most part. There's a lot of side effects, and so being adherent to taking your medications daily as you're supposed to take them is really a challenge for a lot of people. But it was something that I don't ever miss a dose ever. So that's been really, really important. Finding an excellent psychologist, which has taken me the better part of 10 years to finally find the right fit, and I have the right fit now, was a challenge. I think, so there's such a kind of mechanistic way of viewing therapy. It's very much like, you do your cognitive behavioral therapy, or you have your specific model that you're following. And those models just didn't work for me. So I go from person to person trying to find the right one. And finally, what I found was just what he would describe himself as a humanist. Just, being a human being with another human being and talking and learning together about my life experiences has been absolutely fantastic. Having family, if you're lucky enough to have family near you, that's really, really important. I have a wife. We've been married for 12 years now. We have kids, and she's been sort of the bedrock. Like, she can see when I'm cycling. She can notice that maybe my speech is getting faster, or I'm sleeping a little less, or something's going on in my life. Like, I'm getting far too creative or something. And she's like, okay, you might need to go up on your medications a little bit to stop this before it gets too severe. And same thing when it goes downwards into depression. Having my parents has been phenomenal, because they help me, but they really help our family. So when I'm not doing well, I can't take care of my kids in like the day-to-day kind of sense. Like, I can be present a bit, but it's a challenge. And so they usually come in and start helping Candace, my wife, with the kids, and sort of free up some of that burden that I'm not able to do. And then probably I'll break it into two things. Probably two of the most important things in my life as well have been art, and my doctorate actually was a humongous healing journey for sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the work that you're currently doing, you have a Ph.D. in psychiatry?
Yep. So, my whole educational journey is weird. Like I have an economics degree, and then I went to art school, so I got my Bachelor of Fine Arts, and then I got a Master's of Fine Arts right after that. And and then it was about 2 years after finishing my MFA, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, and some really fantastic chance events happened in my life. I got in a room with a professor in psychiatry. Her name's Dr. Pamela Brett McLean, and after half an hour, we figured out I should do a PhD with her, and we should work on it together. And when we started, we had no idea what it was going to be at all. The department, luckily, like the Department of Psychiatry, which is in the Faculty of Medicine, had definitely never had an artist before. No, the Faculty of Medicine as a whole faculty has never had an artist in their faculty before. So, but they were completely open. The way the program was structured was I needed to only take 3 classes, which could be any classes I wanted. Where most times, like when my wife's finishing up her PhD right now in public health, and she had to take like 6 or 8 classes, like a lot of classes, and they're specific to the program to give specific training. But in psychiatry, it was completely open, and the department was supportive of me just going in whatever direction I wanted to. So I had no idea where I was going, what we were doing, and we just started doing things. I started a project with head and neck cancer patients. I was brought on. It was already an ongoing project, and I got brought onto that. And then one of my co-supervisors just said to me another time, "Would you like to go to Iqaluit?" And I said, I don't know what to do, but yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. And he offered funds to get me there. Sort of a great, not completely chance encounter, because I did send out a document, but I sent out a document to the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, which is Canada's largest psychiatric treatment and research facility. And it worked its way all the way from my wife's aunt, and who was a volunteer there, all the way to their VP of education. And he called me up one day, and we started a project in Toronto. And then really, like, I started doing all these activities and just discovering things about myself, discovering things about illness, discovering things about co-creating art together with people that aren't formally trained artists. And my dissertation, in the end, which really came together all in the last year it took 4 years for me to do my PhD. And it all came together in my last year, and what it became about is storytelling. And so the dissertation's called Telling Stories Otherwise. And what it is it talks about mental health stories that the patients that I was working with were going through. I was talking about my own mental health journey that I was going on throughout my life, but also the journey that I was on in my doctoral studies, being affected by the activities that I was doing with patients. And then it really, by telling these stories, I learned a lot about artistic research and creativity, and how to really sustain a creative flow, how to do field research, like a lot of artistic research when you get into higher levels of academia, like when you're doing your master's, or a lot of programs in Canada now are offering PhDs in visual art. And oftentimes what I'm witnessing is people get heavy into like theory and philosophy, and they become like theorists or philosophers, but instead of writing, you do visual art or something like that. And I just wasn't interested in that. And so my dissertation, as it evolved through all these activities, became about how to do field research as an artist, by co-creating art and going places and pushing your expectations, and being uncomfortable was really important. And then I spent a lot of time thinking about creativity, like how to hold that space that seems to just come and go, and is very much in flux. And And then it was a whole body of visual work that I created over my doctoral studies. And so it's a really weird and unusual book that I'm working on getting published right now.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
So one really interesting aspect of your work that I read about was that when you are studying, we'll say, a subject in this environment, that you too go on your own journey in terms of not being well.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah. So I'll give an example of probably the most prominent, the most significant example would be when in 2017, at the beginning of 2017, I had my first research visit to CAMH, which is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. And it was with the first time I went was for 2 weeks in the youth unit. And so it was kids that ranged from maybe 10 to 18 is like the maximum you could be. And so we were there, and that was a significant challenge, seeing kids in an institution like that, being institutionalized. Obviously a significant amount of life events led them there. And then as I was there, they would, and so essentially what I would do there, I wasn't running any tests or doing anything. I was literally just being with people. I would just sit and be with everybody all day. So the typical day for a youth at the CAMH would be breakfast, and then you might have some time in the activity room, which is just essentially a TV, maybe some art supplies. Usually people just sit around talking. And then you might have a group therapy session. You might go to the gym and exercise and play games and things like that for a while. You come back, more downtime, dinner, and so on. So and so what I would do is I would go there first thing in the morning and just be there till it was time for them to go to bed every night. And I would just do all the activities with them. I would go to their therapy sessions, which were really interesting to see different perspectives from different psychiatrists on how they do that. I got into meditation while I was there. We were at the gym and just having a blast playing basketball. But as we would do all these activities and people became more comfortable with me, and they started telling me about their lives, and just absolutely devastating stories of youth with addiction and violence, and what it's like for a kid to be on the street, and what horrific things can happen, and the scars and all the things that would unfold. And so that trip was really difficult, and I remember being it must have been on day 7 or something, and I called my wife, and I'm like, I just can't do this anymore. And we had a trip that we were supposed to go on, like a family vacation, right when I got back, like the day after I got back, and I didn't think I could go. And I just needed to be alone and just recover. But she pressed on, and I took a little bit of a break from going there every day, and then finished up that trip. And in the end, what we actually made with the youth unit was a mural. So we did this free drawing session where we had this huge piece of paper, and everybody was drawing on it. We were coming up with designs. And from all the ideas that emerged there, I came up with a design that all the kids really liked, and we put it on this huge wall that was just a blank wall. And I drew it out one day while they were all just waiting, and then we would all get in there and paint, and there was just this line of kids painting, and it was the first time that I saw kids just being kids again, which was really, really beautiful. But I got through that visit, and I didn't really know what to make of it, other than it was a really beautiful, difficult, profound experience. It wasn't until I went a few months later back, and I was in the mood and anxiety unit, and so that was people that were either in a manic episode, so they were living with bipolar disorder, or in a severe depressed episode. And I really gravitated and connected to 2 manic patients, and somebody living with bipolar disorder, I'd only ever seen it from the inside, and to see what it looks like from the outside was really, really shocking, and but really fascinating. Like the discussions we would have, seeing their trains of thought, and I could sense like, oh yeah, I know how those connections work. Like that's really, really fascinating. And we had this great time together, and then another project emerged when I was there where we just they really want to have photos and videos taken of them in the hospital, but because of ethics concerns, we couldn't do that. But we got permission to take pictures of their rooms, and so they would go and stage their rooms in a certain way. So one patient would really mess up his room and tear it apart and throw things around, and it was sort of trying to capture that kind of chaos in his mind. And then later I found out that he actually did destroy his room right before I got there in the throw of a really intense part of his manic episode. The other patients would leave them the same. Sometimes you'd have, but there was just this really interesting difference between like a manic patient's room, which had all sorts of stuff and activity, and then a depressed person's room, which had absolutely nothing. Like there was nothing moved, just either, other than the bed sheets. Like there was no personal belongings, nothing. It was really interesting to see those states sort of represented in their living spaces that they were in. But I really, really did connect with these two patients. We're still in contact, and they gave me some really interesting ideas. Like I was like, oh, these rooms are really interesting. Maybe I'll go back and create some kind of, set or something that I would design, and maybe we would do the mural from the kids unit and I'd recreate it, and then I'd have parts from the manic patients' rooms and incorporate that, maybe do like a nice photograph or some sort of sculptural installation in a gallery. And as I was thinking about those ideas, and I got back from that trip, within a few weeks I went manic, and it was the most severe manic episode of my life. And, I just felt like, oh, wouldn't it be just so much better to have gone through this with them? I was alone. I was in my house, but I had my family. But, it's a very lonely journey. And it lasted about 4 weeks, and all I could do was paint. So typically what happens during these manic episodes for me is that when I have a really severe manic episode, I learn something completely new that I would never do. So this time was painting, and I went to art school, but I never took painting. I took an intro class to painting, but I never took any of the further classes. And it was I remember it being a real struggle trying to figure out how to mix colors again, and then of course, like being manic, you don't just start with like a small painting. I started with like a 6 foot by 9 foot painting that's like just absolutely humongous. And I worked through that, and then I started building stretchers and stretching the canvas and priming it, and I would do those daily, and then I would paint essentially all night because I was awake for about 22 hours a day. And it was an experience, and I remember being manic and things, you're not thinking necessarily straight, and things are happening really quickly, and you're making kind of like magical deductions and inferences of what's happening, what's going on. But I remember having a little bit of clarity, being like, oh, isn't this so interesting to, been with manic patients, about to make work about their mania, and then myself being manic. And I remember just sort of having this guiding ethos, like, just let the illness guide you wherever it goes. Just go with it through the artwork and leave the artwork as is, and you'll just have this record of this journey, this really, really profound journey. And so what that episode really taught me was that, and this is something that I do in all of my work now, is that the researcher needs to live their research, and that became like kind of a bit of a mantra for me, was to live the work that I was doing, and so this experience at the hospital really affected me and pushed me into a manic episode, and all this work was unfolding, and this is all part of my doctoral journey that I was on. So it was a really, really profound experience, and it's manifested in other ways as well. When I was in the Arctic, I was there doing a suicide prevention conference. I was running an arts-based workshop, and when I got there, I was brought in to do a specific kind of workshop, which is called photo voice. So we would go take photos. Like people in the session would all go take photos. We'd come back and narrate them and discover any underlying themes that were going on in there that might have to do with suicide, because that was on the mind of everybody there. But then on the first day that I got there, somebody else had actually done that, and I was at that one, and I was like, well, now I can't do this. This has already happened. We got double booked. And so what I did is I just sat in the community for 5 days, and where it was taking place was in their high school in Iqaluit, and I just sat and I watched all of those students practice language, drum songs, throats singing, beating and weaving, and all these intensely spiritual artistic acts, and was deeply moved by that, and decided to try out this other arts-based technique that I had learned, which was called image theater. And what we would do is we would go up and make shapes with our body. And so somebody would go up and make a shape with their body. It might be a posture, or it might be some kind of openness with their hands or something. They'll make a shape, and then somebody else goes up and responds. Somebody goes up and responds to that and responds. And after about 4 or 5 responses, we have this living sculpture. And those were really, really quite beautiful. But once again, it took that sort of complete immersion in the community, just spending time talking to people, watching, learning, and being affected by it. I remember calling my wife once again, being like, I don't know if I can do this. This is really intense. Like it's an intense town. It's the epicenter for suicide in Canada, and I forget if it is the leader in the world, but it's way up there as a major place for suicide, and it's a dry town, and there's a lot of history of the Canadian government there. It was, the sense of urgency, the sense of loss was palpable, and it was very, very intense. And I remember they had what still really affects me. They had this quilt that you can tell each student had a square that they put on, and this one student wrote, I miss you, Mom. Thanks for all the years you were able to spend with me. Like, just thinking back to the suicide epidemic, the addiction epidemic that was going on. It was really, really profound, and I got quite unwell from that. And then I did leave. It was only about a 5 or 6 day visit, but those events do change you, and that stayed in my mind for another 2 years until I then turned into an art piece many years later.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've read that you don't like to make the claim that you're involved with art therapy, but just from what you've told me, it certainly sounds like art therapy. So
right.
I'm just wondering why you have difficulty sort of making that claim about some of the work that you've done.
Because I think I'm not going in with the goal to heal. And the first thing, I guess, is I'm not trained as an art therapist. Like, it's a whole master's program that you can take. But I think healing just sort of happens and what I try to do is I just try to create a space for connection, for a feeling of safety, and for a feeling of inclusiveness. Like, you're not going to be excluded in any way for your contributions. And that's kind of what I got relatively good at doing in my doctoral studies, was creating those spaces. And I guess, part of that is a healing journey for these people. It's difficult for me to kind of say.
You're being humble.
Yeah, maybe, but it's hard, to say that.
The correlation with healing is connection, right? And I think probably for a lot of people, it's very difficult to verbalize their illness or their struggle through words, because our words are so limited.
Right.
And so that expression through an artistic avenue is probably completely different. And even just from like some of the work that I'd seen on your website, it just painted a picture that was beyond words, right? I mean, just the tone and the theme and just the experience that it made me feel. That's probably a really important aspect of it.
Yeah, and I structured my dissertation into 3 sections that were called trauma, time, and healing. And so, but I more stuck to my healing journey, because my doctoral studies, for me, was the most profound healing experience I'd ever gone through in my entire life. And when I put that document together, it was like, wow, like I remember in 2015 when I started this, where I was, and now I look at where I am. And I also, I'm not religious in any way, but the only way I can describe it is a healing journey, but also a spiritual journey, whatever that might mean to various different people. But that was it was just so profound. It didn't feel just like healing. It did feel like the only way I could describe it as a spiritual journey.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you could try to describe that spiritual journey, or because I find that word is used so often today and has so many different meanings. And
I think for me, it was about developing an openness to experience. And cultivating that. And it took time. I was when I was particularly sick in my 20s, I never really traveled anywhere. I never really had any capability to understand how to travel and be different places. And so I mainly stuck close to what I knew. And when I got thrust into these different activities in my doctoral studies, I started traveling just all over the place. And so I went to the Arctic, which was a very, very different experience for me. I still remember like getting ready to go on the plane and be like, do I really know what I'm doing? Like, this is like, once I get there, I'm there, Yeah. And, but it was transformative. And so part of that was just opening to some of those experiences that were around travel. I ended up going all over North America. I went to Argentina for an artist residency. I did a whole bunch of different activities. I spent a lot of time going around Canada. I've been all over the place now doing different things in Canada, showing, speaking, and creating and researching. But that spiritual journey, like it was about opening myself up to those experiences, but it was also opening myself up to those really challenging, uncomfortable moments. And I think being with those moments was really, really important. And I don't know. And then I think part of it came back when you start looking at the whole journey and you start creating narratives and connections between events that you wouldn't normally put connections to. And that's just part of weaving a story, You don't tell every single event. You pick out meaningful things. You apply aesthetics, which, gives a structure for the story. And when I started looking at those stories and seeing some of these just really serendipitous, synchronistic kind of things happening, you couldn't help but getting a little bit like, oh, this is like too beautiful to just be coincidence, like all of these things unfolding. And so... But once again, it's not saying there's like some divine force or something guiding that. I still don't quite feel that, but it felt bigger than the sum of its parts. Okay. And so being on that kind of journey and looking back at that was really interesting. And then also near the end of my journey, only in the past 9 or 10 months or so, I started really getting into Carl Jung's ideas on the collective unconscious. And once again, he was very, very much of like a mystic, pulling from shamanism, pulling from Eastern philosophies, and creating these really fascinating ideas. And so I got really into that, and I really, and pulling from that idea of the collective unconscious, which is this shared psychic space between all humans. And you can understand that as maybe like some external space, like some larger form of consciousness or something that we engage with. Or from evolutionary terms, it can be looked at as, we were all some form of primate before. We all share similar neural structures, and we were... obviously we have various instincts and drives and things that we're just born with to survive, to procreate, and so those things were passed down. And like one of the things that I like thinking about is having kids. This is sort of one way I think about the collective unconscious is my kids, when they have bad dreams, it's this monster. And it's sort of like, when they describe it, it's like an amalgamation of a whole bunch of predatory animals. And I think that could be, imprints of wolves and bears and different sorts of animals that we would have encountered over the past few million years in particular, kind of get embedded. Like, you got to be scared of these things. Like, don't, take the chance and not be scared of them and then get eaten or something like that.
Right.
And so... seeing that thing, with no sort of environmental exposure to them, they're imprinted in their brains. And so I get really interested with thinking about my kids and their dreams. And then those dreams shift and change. And now we dream about, when you're an adult, you dream about things that are happening in your world. They shift to different kinds of stressors that are more immediate and that evolved throughout your lifetime. And so I got into the collective unconscious, and I started thinking about Jung, and I started thinking with Jung. And I was reading and being with his writings and getting into that same kind of mental space that he was in. And it's all I can say is it's an absolutely beautiful, productive space for any creative person, and I think any person in the end to go on. And Jung, he really believed that life is essentially a spiritual journey, and it's an individual journey. So this is where I get hung up with religion, conventional monotheistic religions, is that you're told what your spiritual journey is supposed to be.
Right.
It's already happened. You're just doing it over again. Like somebody already did that spiritual journey. Jesus did that spiritual journey or something and died on the cross. And where it's like, no, like everybody is on their own individual spiritual journey, and it's going to be different, and it's going to be fraught with different challenges, and that's what it is, and that's what makes it so important and so self-actualizing. And I got really interested in that, and it's led down to a whole new area of research. That's just on the verge and very exciting for me.
Yeah. So speaking of spirituality, I can't help but think of how spirituality now is becoming married with science in the world of psychedelics as we progress.
Yeah.
And of course, you did mention mysticism, and some of the themes that you've talked about for me sort of brings me to that realm. And obviously, right now there's a renaissance happening, a psychedelic renaissance, and the research is moving exponentially. Yeah. And I'm not entirely sure if you want to talk about it, but
I'll talk about it in certain ways, because once again, like I said earlier, all of a sudden having a fresh doctorate in psychiatry. No, I'm not a clinical doctor in any ways. I'm a mental health researcher, but I figure around psychedelics, maybe I should be a little bit careful, but I'll tell you a little bit about how I came into being with it. Is once again through Carl Jung, his ideas of the collective unconscious. I was really interested in creativity. And I was starting to learn about different parts of your brain and how they work in different creative states. There's lots of different kinds of creative states you can enter into, different areas of your brain you can access. And so I got really interested when I found this area, this description of an area that you pull from called your emotional structures in your brain. So that's kind of like in the center of your brain in your limbic system, which is fairly recent, but not terrifically recent, not like our cortex, which is primarily for primates and specifically really, really large in humans. And so I got interested in these emotional structures, specifically when this one article said that they're universal. And then I was like, oh, maybe this is the area that Carl Jung was pointing to before there was a really advanced field of neuroscience in his lifetime. And I started just doing all kinds of literature scans on creativity and these parts of the brain. And then I stumbled across what is now a great interest of mine, which is psychedelic research. And it was this article by Robin Carhart Harris and more, but primarily him. And he was talking about this theory of the brain on psychedelics, and he gets into some of the medical applications. But essentially what the theory was he called it the entropic brain. And so entropy is a theory from physics, which is, something that is a system that is high in entropy is very disordered. A system that's low in entropy is you're very certain of where things are, and it's a very kind of low energy state. And so essentially our brains, to conserve energy and to do all kinds of things, exist in a fairly constrained state. And then it's more evolutionarily of an advantage to be in this lower state. And so we can be more certain of our environment. Our sampling of our environment is more precise. And so everything gets a bit more precise, but it also to me becomes almost like a hallucination. Like you're not actually experiencing reality, like this room that we're experiencing right now. You're experiencing your experience of your brain making sense out of these things. And so essentially what he proposed in his, and a lot of people have been talking about this same network in the brain is it's called the default mode network. And so it's this network that in your brain, it ties together lots of parts of your brain, but essentially it's particularly important in your sense of self. And so your idea that, I'm Brad, I'm someone different than this person walking down the street and this person, and you have your own story, and then it's kind of like this really introspective thing that you can go down. And then what he was showing through his scans is that he was doing these neuroimaging scans when people were under the effects of psilocybin, and what they were seeing was just this absolute complete ignition of the entire brain. And so instead of brain regions just communicating like visual areas, talking to visual areas, auditory areas, talking to auditory, self-reflection, all kind of happening in the down the center of your brain, everything lit up. And things that would never connect started making connections. Areas that in the default mode network began to sort of decouple or shut down, and essentially your brain goes through this really intense phase transition. And so what he's saying is that there's a form of waking consciousness that we're all experiencing, that I'm experiencing right now, that you're probably experiencing as well, I would assume.
I think so.
And you'd be in this state of waking consciousness. And then when you would take psychedelics, and he also does, and this is also great interest to me in my research, is generally altered states of consciousness, meditation, right, daydreaming, dreaming itself. But psychedelics are such a great thing because you can give it to anybody, and no matter what, there's going to be some kind of phenomenological experience that's going to happen in your conscious experience. And what he was talking about is that your brain actually goes through a phase transition, and it lights up, shuts down other areas, and enters this really high entropy state. So there's just so much disorder going on in the brain, but also your conscious experience is so much more disordered and magical, and you're making connections that you normally wouldn't make, and you're experiencing things in fundamentally different ways. And what happens is when they're giving high doses of psilocybin, your sense of self completely dissolves. You can experience ego death or psychic death or whatever word you want to use, and you enter into this, so I'm told, this plane of like this transpersonal plane where you might be united with the universe or experience God in a certain way. But what happens is that sense of self gets out of the way, and then you have this really unifying, immediate experience that can only be described as spiritual or mystical, because it's so ineffable to describe what you're experiencing and the sensations. There is no language for that. And so entering into that, what he calls the primary state of consciousness, which he's arguing is sort of like what primordial humans would have experienced. Probably animals have similar experiences because they don't have a lot of the really advanced, evolutionarily advanced regions that our prefrontal cortex has in our brains. And it might be a bit closer to what kids experience. Like when I look at my kids and they're completely overwhelmed by their emotions and can't regulate them, and that's kind of, as you get older, your prefrontal cortex gains more control. You get a better sense of yourself, and then you kind of rein in that really magical reality. But I think my interest in psychedelics is primarily, I think, mystical. I would say that's, really following through what Jung was thinking about the collective unconscious, about the idea of individuation, which is that sort of spiritual process that everybody goes on in their life. Karl Maslow would have called it self-actualization. That's what I get really interested in. But then I can't help it because I've been in the Department of Psychiatry. I've been around psychiatrists and mental health researchers for a number of years now, is the psychiatric implications of psychedelics, and mostly the research is being done on psilocybin right now, which is magic mushrooms. It's too breathtaking to ignore. Yeah. Like it's just like I won't spout out the statistics, but they are so profound for treatment-resistant depression. So they're doing a lot of studies on treatment-resistant depression, and that's essentially you've tried some kind of antidepressant, some sort of SSRI, and then done some kind of psychological therapy, and none of it's working to treat your depression. So it's typically a group that are essentially, stuck living in this state, and so they've been able to get ethics approval to work with this group of people because there's nothing else that can happen, so we might as well try it. And the success rate is phenomenal from a single dose, and it can last upwards of 6 months, upwards of 14 months. They're still doing studies. They're coming out all the time right now of the long-lasting effects. And this is in a group of people that are essentially hopeless. Like this is a group of people that there are people being euthanized for this level of treatment-resistant depression. They can't live like this anymore. And then there's like, there's this compound that maybe you don't have to go through an end-of-life process to get out of this. And it's very, very interesting. It's very early days. Like the sample sizes they're drawing from are small. They're not completely double-blind randomized control trials, which is sort of like the dream in the scientific community. But what they're showing is, in my understanding, is the safety protocol, that this is a very therapeutic and safe thing to do, which then hopefully they can go and do the really big trials that really, really show the benefits. But and there's research being done on LSD, which is very, very similar to psilocybin, just slightly different, does a slightly different thing on one of your receptors, which makes it last longer. And then ayahuasca as well. They're doing a lot of research on depression, but with psilocybin, the research that they're doing on right now is on depression. They hope to get to just study depression itself, so maybe it doesn't have to be a last resort thing. Maybe it could be something that you just have once and then you get rid of it before it becomes ingrained in your brain. Because the way that they're kind of understanding depression right now is that, like I was saying with the entropy in your brain, is that it's a very low entropy state. So it's very fixed, it's very focused inward on yourself. And psilocybin it looks like it's breaking that up, whether it's growing new connections around, whether it's an insight that emerges that allows you to overcome some of those. I'm not 100% sure exactly what it is. But then, there's a lot of studies being done on OCD, which again is another fixed state. Addiction, which again is another fixed state.
Right. Rigid patterns, really.
Rigid patterns. And they're proving to be fantastic. One of the most interesting studies, which I'm very interested in, is terminal cancer patients,
right.
And the anxiety and depression, the death anxiety that comes with dying,
right.
And they're doing these studies by giving quite a high dose of psilocybin, so you get that intense mystical experience, and people have a completely new outlook going into the end of their life,
right.
And like for me, I just get fascinated. It's like, couldn't everybody benefit from that kind of stuff? Aren't we all a little bit worried about dying at all times? Like, isn't that existential threat present pretty much at all times? And what would happen if we could alleviate that in all kinds of people and you could live this freer life? So, I'm intensely interested. And then there's also the content that emerges. And this is, as an artist, is what I get interested in, because I'm very interested in what content the artist has to offer humanity that is slightly different than, or that is fundamentally different than what the sciences have to offer around objective reality. I think the arts, literature, visual, music, dance, poetry, all these things, they access a very profound subjective reality that is within each of us. And so while science seems very good at understanding objective reality outside of ourselves,
right.
It seems very limited in understanding the whole universe that goes on within the most complex thing in the universe, our brain.
Right.
And so I think the arts has a specific well of subjective truths to pull from and develop and express. And psychedelics, this is why I got interested, is because they seem to be able to access that, and people have very universal experiences they have very similar visual experiences, very similar emotional experiences, really structured, like especially from what I understand with ayahuasca, which has DMT in it, like this connection to nature and Gaia and these things that people keep experiencing over and over again, separate from each other, it's just so fascinating.
Yeah. Now, ayahuasca, that's used primarily by indigenous tribes in the Amazon.
Yeah, they've used it for, I think, millennia. They can't track it completely how far, but the rituals go back very, very far. And same with magic mushrooms and psilocybin. It's been used by indigenous cultures for millennia. And you can find, when you start really talking to people that are interested in psilocybin, there's, relics that go back 10,000 years that show these mushrooms being a really, really significant part of their spiritual reality. And, like I always get interested in what it must have been like for like these Spanish conquistadors to come across, and they have their sacrament, which is, bread and wine, the body and blood of Christ. And that sacrament, you take it, and the phenomenological experience is nil. Like it's like it's just like, okay, I've done it. It's like, okay, like, yeah. And then they look across at these people that they just came to in Central America, and they are experiencing God
the divine
firsthand.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine what that experience. That must have been a really, really unmooring experience. And I can see why. Well, I don't see why, but
why they'd want to suppress that.
Yeah, why they would want to suppress that, because it's like my sacrament doesn't, really give me that God experience, but this one does. And so, they're fantastically interesting compounds. And, the spiritual significance is something I'm interested in the psychiatric, implications of it, because healing people and some of these really debilitating diseases would be just remarkable. To free people from.
Do you think for so many people today that are experiencing depression and anxiety, it really just stems from disconnection in terms of not necessarily having meaning in their life? I experienced some pretty severe anxiety myself, and really it just stemmed from being in a place of disconnection and feeling sort of nihilistic about the world and my place in it. And then actually I discovered Buddhism. And started studying that definitely more from a secular perspective.
Yep.
But it was really the philosophy and the meditation practice that allowed me to heal.
Yeah.
And that for me has been extremely profound in terms of my journey. Not to say that I was actually diagnosed with severe anxiety, but I was definitely at the point where I was having panic attacks and different things like that. And so, it just seems like that's really at the core of people's experience today, is as we move away from some of the traditional religions like Christianity, it seems like there's a void. Yeah. And psychedelics create this very unique spiritual experience that connect people with the world around them, connect people with themselves and each other.
For sure. I think, I always like to go back to think from evolutionary terms, but I think, we're not evolved to live in this contemporary world. This is completely insane what our brains have built. These fast-moving cars, these devices in our pockets that can access the entire wealth of human knowledge, just never-ending content, and then of course getting stuck in capitalism, where everything has to be about productivity and doing things and working smarter and all these sort of productivity-driven ideas around life. And that's just not how we evolved. We evolved in the plains of the savannah of Africa, and we were built for that environment to move around as groups and hunt and then it just really, really exploded. And I can't, I just feel so strange in this world sometimes, and so strangely disconnected. And then everybody's doing their own thing, and they've got jobs, and they've got all these, and nobody really seems to, connect in a profound way. Where, with psychedelics, it's profound connection to the natural living world, which I think is something that we need more of,
right?
100%. That, like, people that don't necessarily have that profound of a connection to the natural world, to biodiversity, to understanding climate change, to understanding all the things that we're doing to this planet, I think, and like, I do want to preface that, like, I feel like psychedelics are one of those great ways to get from here to there in like 6 hours or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, but it's not a sustained thing, because like you can't, psychedelics are inherently non-addictive because
Right.
you can't take them, you can't abuse them, because they your brain develops an intense amount of tolerance for a few days after taking it. All your receptors are desensitized and so on. If you take LSD, they all like actually go into your neurons and have to come back out. And so you just like there just is no real chance for addiction and abuse, but it gets you to that state. And then I feel like that's where, like you were saying, Buddhism and meditation, that's where I think meditation, mindfulness really comes in as that sustained practice.
Right.
But it's like a lot of people with meditation, when you start, you're kind of like, oh, I'm just sitting here, I can't stop thinking, this is really, really hard. And then after a few times, you probably give up because you don't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. But if you know where you're headed with it, which is...
If you've seen the path.
If you've seen the path, and once again, like a psychedelic brain is very, very similar to a meditative brain. Mm-hmm. They look very much the same under scans, and the phenomenological experience is very, very similar.
Right.
And meditation is one of those really great daily practices.
Yeah.
And so having that sort of jumping point to go there and then guide you the rest of the way, I think is really, really interesting.
Yeah. I've had many psychedelic experiences myself, mm-hmm. and I've definitely experienced like my ego dissolving completely.
Oh, wild. Yeah.
And with that said, it was almost as if I was able to perceive my life more objectively.
Yeah.
And when I came down, it was almost like my fragmented self, my fragmented ego was sort of compiling.
Right.
And I was able to see the pattern so clearly of my personality, both positive and negative.
Yeah.
And then from that point forward, I had a roadmap in terms of, that's not good. And then like self-doubt or whatever it might be, and all these sort of aspects of who I am coming together, and just seeing it with so much clarity was just so transformative for me.
Yeah. And that kind of like, it's like, looking through a fresh set of eyes. Like we're so used to that ego that we live with, mm-hmm. that sense of self that we live with, narrating our life, making sense out of all the things that are going on, and to get rid of that and allow this open. It could be thought of as objective, because it seems like it's not being affected by our own self-identity and self-understanding. I think is I think a psychedelic experience is like a year of therapy, like every single time. Like it's
Wasn't it Timothy Leary that said it was like 10 years of psychotherapy?
Oh, maybe it's 10 years. Maybe I'm being a bit cautious with that much.
I mean, that came from Timothy Leary.
Yeah,
right?
It came from Timothy Leary.
So, and he was quite the character. Mm-hmm. But that's a story in itself.
Yeah.
But and I mean, even with the meditation practice too, it was just shifting my relationship with my thoughts and my emotions. Yeah. Not identifying with them nearly as much, but sort of perceiving them. Obviously, still experiencing them as you would, but experiencing them with a little bit of distance. Yeah. More of noticing rather than being. Yeah. And that for me was an incredible shift as well in terms of, mm-hmm. So it's like all we really have is consciousness and its contents. But if you can actually tap into that broader awareness, I think that's where the magic happens. Mm-hmm. It's there that you can hold everything with compassion. And definitely with the psychedelics, I've entered that space where I feel like I am synchronized with this higher consciousness. I've really, like, I've spent a lot of time thinking about consciousness now, like just as itself, through meditation, through thinking about psychedelics, through creativity, which I believe is another like when you especially get into creative flow, is another form of altered state of consciousness. It's just like, how do you do a brain scan of somebody in creative flow? Because like it's not as like you can't lay still and be in creative flow. It just doesn't make any sense. So I would be interested in seeing that someday. But that like, and once again, I think this is where I want to spend like a lifetime exploring is consciousness. Like I feel like all these other parts of my journey, living with mental illness,
researching other people's mental illness, living with that in my life, incorporating that in my life has been really, really profound. But I think it's all led to this point of really trying to, understand what this thing consciousness is.
Yeah.
And is it external? Is it purely internal? What does it mean? Does it matter if it's either of those? I think going to be my life journey for the next while.
Yeah. And in terms of your work too, you do virtual reality as well, right?
Yeah.
And I find that really fascinating because, of course, as technology evolves, we're going to be entering a world soon where virtual reality is going to become very accessible and sophisticated. I can imagine from your perspective using that as an incredible tool to create empathy.
Yeah, I think, like, for me, my interest is just developing in virtual reality. I just started dabbling in it just over a year ago.
Okay.
And I got a former student of mine who has some experience with Unity and translating some of content into Unity, which then can be made into a virtual reality experience. I was already doing stuff with 3D modeling, 3D animation. And so I got her to help me start porting those in, and she still is helping me create new experiences. For me, what interested me so much about virtual reality was one from a very artistic point of view, like, a painting is there in front of you, and it's the whole experience is there, and it's all dictated by what's happening in that two-dimensional plane. A video, although it has a temporal aspect, still has a beginning, still has an end. It's still, you don't have much agency. Things just unfold. It's, but when I started thinking about virtual reality, I was like, oh, wow, isn't this like so great? Like, the viewer can dictate their experience. If they want to focus in on one thing, they can. If they want to look around, they can experience the whole space. And so I think that's what really grabbed me about it. And then what I found is I started making virtual reality experiences that were essentially rooms or landscapes from my research. So there was this one piece that was in a Iqaluit, so it's this sort of made up Iqaluit space, and you would be in this Arctic tundra on the bay, and then another one was in this really surreal, colorful, manic room that is like a psychiatric hospital room, and just being in there and your whole visual field being immersed. And now I'm getting into audio as well with this to completely immerse yourself in it. People were saying that they felt like they empathized more with the things that I was hoping to talk about. And I approached it purely from like an artistic, like, oh, look, we can give the viewer some agency, they can figure out how they want things to unfold. And something kind of unexpected came out of that, which was interesting to me.
Yeah. When it comes to having a manic episode for you, do you approach them now with optimism? Or because it seems like whenever it does happen, obviously, like you said, there's a lot of suffering with the experience, but you come out of it with this profound truth and usually a new piece of art or inspiration.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering because so much of life, I think, is a philosophy. Like, for example, life not happening to you, but life happening for you changes everything. It seems simple, but it's a game changer. So I'm just wondering if, not that you're embracing an episode, but I imagine that probably has been part of your journey too, right?
Yeah, well, manic episodes are different for everybody. For me, they are a space that you enter into when you have unlimited potential to do like anything. Like you feel like you could stop a car with your hand if you wanted to, but for me, luckily, I don't do that. And then
right.
I delve into art, and so one episode it was a month-long episode. I taught myself how to paint, started painting, and I really enjoy painting, and I have a painting practice that's not the main focus of my artistic practice, but it's part of it. And then from that time, I was also writing field notes as I was manic about the experiences I was having with my family. And those writings merged into a short story, which then became a short film, and I read all the time. I present it in all sorts of different ways. I put different visuals behind me. I play with audio that might happen as I speak, but I do a lot of live readings of this piece. It's called Alberta No. 3, and it's about family and that manic experience and weaving a story out of that. Another time, I wrote a play, and I've never written a play before. And I wrote a play, and it premiered in Toronto a year ago, which was a really weird experience.
Wow.
And, but once again, it was feeding off that experience that I had in following that visit to CAMH, and I was rethinking through that again through dialogue and through a story of a doctor and a patient working together, and then the last time was I wrote a novel actually, and in a period of 2 weeks.
Wow. And
once again, something like writing is not my main thing, but it seems to be something that I keep turning to in these states. And what happened with that novel, which I need to work on it because it's very, very raw content, but it was like transcribing a vision. Mm-hmm. And so it was this altered state of consciousness induced by mania, and things were just unfolding, and it felt like they were from like a past life, or they were already written and I was just transcribing them. It was just a very different sensation. And so that was like that. I still look back at that one. That was just a bit under a year ago. And that was a really, really profound experience. And then what the interesting part is that after I come out of those states, I have a new skill, which is like really unusual to have all these weird skills to pull from as an artist. But I think that's important as an artist to have many skills and not be just devoted to one thing. So it's. I do go with a slight bit of optimism, but it's also a horrifying experience.
Of course, yes.
It's like a mix. Like there's something
I didn't
positive.
mean to be insensitive.
No, not at all. But it is something that when it's happening, it's like, okay, what's going to happen this time? And like it's like a psychedelic experience. It's not a fun experience, but it's an interesting experience.
Right.
You know. So.
Yeah. Are you completely aware that it's happening, or?
I don't think at first, but then once you narrate that to yourself, like, oh, I'm going through a manic episode, it becomes pretty, like the patterns become pretty clear.
Right.
It's and everyone's a little bit different. The speeds are different. Like the last time I had a really interesting relation with time, and like this sort of it's like remembering from the future. Like it was this really weird relation to time that I still don't know how to make sense out of. And once again, this is probably why I kept getting more and more interested in mystical experiences, is because I kept having these manic episodes that were becoming progressively more and more mystical each time. Different components of reality were shifting and changing, it's very interesting.
I'm just thinking about my own experiences with MDMA in particular, and obviously I'm not going to make a comparison with a manic episode, but there are parallels where I do feel infinite potential and love and energy. And
no, that's interesting. It's something MDMA is something I actually don't know too much about, although I was just doing some reading about it and like a combination between MDMA and therapy,
right,
and how productive that is, because you kind of overcome some of the barriers that you would have with your therapist, where you might not feel comfortable sharing something, even though you might be completely unconscious that you don't want to share things, but you're kind of impeding your own way. And then that opening up and just feeling compassion for the person across the room, for you feeling love, and when you have that level of love between two people, you can share anything,
right,
and it completely opens up. And the anecdote that I was this person in this article was talking about was that these really profound realizations that were completely unconscious came out and completely opened up this person's life anew.
Yeah, there's been a lot of significant research in relation to PTSD in particular and MDMA, and I believe they're actually in phase 3 of the trials. And cool. As far as I know, the FDA has claimed MDMA as breakthrough therapy.
Yeah, I think they did actually claim that. Yeah,
so they're saying within 3 to 5 years it'll be removed from not phase 1, but Schedule 1 to Schedule 2.
Yeah.
And that's going to be really fascinating because it has a very profound effect too on deactivating the amygdala.
Oh, yeah.
Which is the reptilian aspect of our brain related to fear. And so I believe, obviously facilitated with a clinical session, folks are able to explore past traumas
Yeah.
that otherwise they wouldn't be able to process because it would kick in the fear response, right?
Right.
That fight or flight.
I think, honestly, in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to, just like in Canada with cannabis dispensaries coming up before it was legal, and then slowly the medical information coming out and then it becoming legalized. I could see really, really great treatment facilities coming up in the next decade using psychedelics, MDMA, all sorts of these really profound spiritual compounds. And once again, like I'm not a fan of thinking of these things as recreational drugs. I really don't like the idea of like young kids just thinking they're tripping out and having some weird experiences looking at their hands or something like that.
Yeah, been there, done that.
Yeah, but like I think that those are very, very serious,
Absolutely.
fascinating, spiritual, medicinal substances that need to be taken incredibly seriously, and this should 100% not be completely illegal. Whether, I don't know if it's completely released for recreational use because they're still doing a lot on safety. Everything right now looks like it's intensely safe to use, but still more time. But medicinally, I can't understand how they're still not used constantly, and why we have to get these really expensive clinical trials with only a couple people getting the benefits and so on. So I'm excited to see what's going to happen in the next few years for sure.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an exciting time for sure. And it feels like it's all happening. It really does.
I know.
So, especially too with Oregon recently.
Yeah.
Legalizing psilocybin.
And Denver.
Right.
Decriminalized it.
Yeah. Sorry, not legalizing, but decriminalizing.
Yeah. So
There's a slight
they
difference
just don't
there.
prosecute anymore, but it's still illegal, but you just don't get prosecuted.
But it's really important, right? Just to, remove the stigma as well.
Yeah, well, I know the stigma around psychedelics, like the history is so fascinating, and if anybody wants to get into like a thorough but accessible read on psychedelics, is Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. It was like I jumped into the scientific articles and then read his book and then got into scientific articles, but it's a great way to just open your mind to some of the potentials of this. The history is really, really fascinating, how, it got used by the counterculture, and, Nixon declares Timothy Leary, who was a major psychedelic researcher and explorer and a major proponent of the counterculture, being called the most dangerous man in America.
Right. Yeah.
And then the drug law that put everything to Schedule 1, which is completely insane, because Schedule 1 is for things that have no medicinal benefit and high chance for abuse. Right. And these drugs, you can't abuse them. They're just your brain can't abuse them, and there's no desire. Like, I don't know anybody that's had a psychedelic trip that's like, I want to do that right away again.
No.
Like it just doesn't happen. And then they have huge medicinal benefits, and that was even being shown in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
They were using it in AA for alcoholism. They were already studying with depression. They were doing all kinds of really interesting work with it. It just got tied up into a very specific political moment.
Right.
Got shut down. And it's a real disservice, I think, to humanity to block this research. Once again, like, I don't know for sure if it is the wonder substance that it's being claimed to be, but it sure does look like it.
Yeah.
And it just to block something that could be so medicinal and so spiritually activating and create connection between people and the environment, I think it's so necessary in this age right now.
Yeah, I think too in the 50s and 60s, psychedelics were like a direct assault on order.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, the war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And people were waking up and asking questions and rebelling to the status quo.
Yeah.
And I think President Nixon at the time just shut it down.
Like, one interesting thing that I have a friend who is a psychologist, and he's finishing up his Ph.D. in psychology right now. And what he's looking at with psychedelics is a personality trait called openness to experience. And so there's sort of the big 5 personality traits. I don't know if I can remember them all. I think agreeableness, neuroticism, openness to experience. Extroversion. It spells out ocean. Maybe I should have started with O first.
Yeah.
Openness to experience. Anyways, they're all there. Neuroticism is one of them. And anyways, what these studies are showing is that not only are there medical benefits to this, but actually something like your personality can be fundamentally shaped by a psychedelic experience. For like one dose can last, they've done studies up to 14 months, and it might actually go even longer. And what it's affecting is this trait called openness to experience. And so when you have high openness to experience, you are much more in touch with your emotions, you feel beauty, you enjoy art, you're open to experience, you will do more things. And actually low openness to experience, if you score really low on that, there was a study, I can't remember who did it now, but it was a really large study, and it actually showed that you're much more likely to fall into the trap of like right-wing authoritarianism.
That was Jonathan Haidt.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so like this idea that you think that when you enter adulthood, you're fixed, your personality is fixed, you are who you are, you might have some room for growth, but like that you can actually like change your entire perception of the world. And it's such a great one to experience. Like, who doesn't want to experience more beauty and art and be more in touch with their emotions? Like, it's like, who wouldn't want that rather than being scared all the time or something like that? To feel that it would be so liberating, self-actualizing. And I think that's really interesting. And once again, you'll see things like that happen with meditation and other forms as well. It's just psychedelic is one of those great things that you can study because you just give anybody it. Right. Map their experience, and you can follow them out. Where meditation is one of those things that takes a long time to develop. But,
yes.
It's just it's absolutely fascinating
for sure. Brad, I think we covered a lot of ground there.
Okay, cool.
And I know that you got to head out and you have obligations, but thank you so much for sitting down. That was a really insightful conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And before we park it here, where can people find your work?
So the best place to find it is bradnecyk.com. So Brad, B-R-A-D, Necyk, Necyk. .com, and I keep that heavily updated. I'm always taking things off, putting things on, trying to create some sort of narrative about the work that I'm doing. It has a lot of the visual work. It has bits of the play. It has some of the writings on it. It's got a whole breadth of things, and it's where my most kind of active things are. If people are ever interested in seeing the practice, I keep an Instagram account that is at Brad Necyk, and that is very much it for me. It's nice sharing things, but it's actually an archive for me. And so I use it actually in when I write to figure out when I was thinking about certain things, because I always post whatever I'm working on that day or something. So there's usually a daily post or every few days or something. And it's what's exactly happening in my practice right now. And usually what's there is never a finished product. It's always like the first idea. And then it might take a few weeks or a month or something to finalize it. But I think it's a really interesting place just to see what a creative practice looks like and how it's changing all the time, and how you have an idea here, but then you never return to it later, but it still was something. It was happening in that moment. So
it's constantly progressing and evolving, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Veracity podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to support us, be sure to like, comment, or share. You can also follow us at Veracity Podcast on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook for updates and exclusive content. If you're interested in being a featured guest on the show, you can visit our website at veracitypodcast.com and head on down to the Contact Us section. Thanks again for listening. It means so much to us, and stay tuned for more conversations just like this.